Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Before we begin today's episode, I want to say thank you to our newest supporters, Lisa, Patricia, David, Tay, and Olga. We truly appreciate your generosity. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Or if you prefer to make a one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And as always, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is one of the best ways to show your support, and we always appreciate it. Now with all that being said, let's get ready and start the show. Welcome yet again to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you all for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. Today, we have 11 amazing listener stories, so without further ado, let's get into it. Today's first listener story comes to us from Tosca. Tosca's story is called Grandma's Haunted House. Tosca says, "Hey Nick, I've had a couple of paranormal experiences at my grandma's house. Not bad experiences, but they definitely scared me a bit. This may be a bit lengthy. The first was when I was 11. It was around 1 a.m. on New Year's Day, and I was in the bedroom with my dad and brother. I was on my cot, while they were on the bed. Now, keep in mind, I was wide awake, and it was pitch black in the bedroom. I was trying to fall asleep by staring into the darkness. After a couple of minutes of this, I noticed something strange. The outline of a hand. It was just a hand. I could see it clearly though, because it was darker than dark. It came towards my face, as if trying to pet me, but I was terrified and hid under my blanket. After a minute or so of hiding, I peeked out and it was gone. I walked over to my dad and woke him up, and I told him I saw a ghost hand. He said it was probably one of my dead relatives, trying to pet my head." The next experience I had in my grandma's house was 2 years ago or so. But first, a little background. My auntie passed away about 4 years ago. Her and my grandma lived together, and when my auntie was looking for my grandma, she'd always say, "Bert, where are you?" With that being said, now back to the story. My dad, brother, and I were sitting on the couch, each doing our own thing, when all of a sudden we looked up at each other, all puzzled. My dad asked, "Did you guys hear that?" My brother and I both responded with, "Yes, I heard, 'Bert, where are you?' over by the door." I knew it was my auntie. From time to time, we also noticed little things like the bathroom door locking, voices, and bangs on the walls. I don't think these ghosts are bad. I think they're just my relatives watching over us and wanting us to know that they are there. I have a couple more experiences, some which are mine, and some are my parents'. Thank you for listening and reading. I hope you are safe and well. Our next listener story comes to us from Lydia. Lydia's story is called Camping Story. Lydia says, "Hello. I'm writing after listening to the story of one of your listeners from their camping trip in the Uwharrie National Forest. I absolutely got chills listening to them recount strange noises and lights because of how similar it was to an experience I had with my Girl Scout troop over 15 years ago. I guess I had put it in the back of my mind and written it off as silly, but I want to share it now, so that listener knows they aren't alone. It was early autumn, maybe October or November, and my Girl Scout troop of 7 girls was camping overnight in the Uwharrie National Forest one weekend. I was about 15 at the time, and I've never been great at sleeping in new places, much less a tent floor. While I was tossing and turning, I remember hearing what sounded like quiet, distorted voices talking. Sometimes they sounded a couple feet away, and sometimes like they were coming from very far away. At the time, I attributed it to maybe other campers that might have had tents set up near us, even though I hadn't seen anyone that day. The voices sounded deep, like they were male, so it didn't seem possible that they were from our campsite, as the troop members and leaders were all females, whose voices I had been familiar with for years. After an hour or so of trying to sleep, I get up to go to the bathroom, waking my friend up to come with me, as I joked that there was no way my city girl self was going to get eaten by a bear or lost while trying to go to the bathroom. We took the short walk and my friend stood watch for me. When we traded places, I remember seeing what seemed like floating lights through the trees in the distance, and I assumed it was flashlights from other campers. Again, despite not seeing anyone else nearby before sunset. On our way back, I started to get the feeling you get when you're being watched. When my hair stood up on the back of my neck, I remember joking to my friend that I hoped no axe murderers were following us. I will always remember her looking back at me with huge wide eyes and asking if I was hearing the voices too. I realized then that the same murmuring sound I heard in the tent was present with us now as well, despite being some distance from where I heard it originally. It seemed to kind of just rise up around us. We, being teenage girls who loved horror movies, and who were determined not to be the ones who die first, booked it at top speed back to the tent. As we were trying to get our heart rates back down and zip up the tent, there was this tremendous roar that woke the rest of the girls up. We didn't get much sleep after that. The next morning we all talked about the roar and decided that it must have been a mountain lion. My friend and I stayed quiet about our experience, as we didn't want to seem crazy, and figured we'd probably blew it out of proportion, given the spooky quality of the forest at nighttime. But I've never forgotten the feeling of being stalked and hunted. I still don't think that roar was a mountain lion, as it seemed more, I don't know how to describe it, hollow, abrupt. Whether it was a mountain lion or something else, it makes me glad to never camp again. So, to the listener who shared their story about the Uwharrie National Forest, you aren't alone in your experience. Our next story of the night comes from M. M's story is called Invisible UFO in Mississippi. M says, "Hello, Nick. I recently began listening to your podcast on the recommendation of a friend, and I have already binged many of the episodes. I have always had the intention to write about this experience, but I've never known where to do so, until now. I have had several unexplainable experiences, but this one is the one that baffles me the most. This experience happened when I was 13 or 14 years old. My mom and I were staying with my grandmother, who lives in a rural area outside of Mabin, Mississippi. When I say rural, I mean you can see the Milky Way almost every night, and the land is crawling with critters and life. I've had other strange events happen out there, but this is by far the strangest. I decided to go for a walk just before sunset. As I walked around the property, 5 or so of the outside dogs followed me around. There is very little to do, and I was alone with my thoughts. I sat down in the field and poked around in the dirt. I began to hear the wind in the distance. You know how in a large open area you can hear the trees begin to rustle in the distance before you feel the wind come up onto you. I looked up to watch the trees swaying. I was confused because nothing was moving. I looked all around me and everything was eerily still. Then I started to notice that there was no other noises, no birds chirping or small animals moving about. I noticed then that the dogs, who were tough outdoor dogs and not pets, were standing completely motionless with their hackles up. After 20 to 30 seconds had passed, I began to discern which direction the sound was coming from. I was frozen with fear, and I knew something was off, and I looked up into the sky to see what was making this noise. There were a few wispy high-altitude clouds in the distance, but the sky above me was clear. I was looking right at where the sound was coming from, and tracking it as it slowly moved overhead. The sound was not directly over me, but enough that my head tilted back. It sounded like whatever it was slowly hovering, only a few hundred feet off the ground, yet I saw nothing at all. I've heard some stories where people can see an outline or a mirage-type illusion, but I saw nothing. The dogs were also looking up at the same spot. My heart was racing, and I wanted to run away, but I was too scared to move, and so were they. To my horror, the wind-like sound stopped moving, and suddenly changed to a high-pitched electronic whirring noise. The closest thing that I can relate it to is the sound an ATM machine makes when you deposit cash. I was still just frozen with fear, but somewhere in my mind I thought, if I threw a rock into the sky, I was sure that I'd see it bounce. I was too afraid to do so, even though I was curious. I just stood there as this sound continued for another 10 to 15 seconds. The sound then changed back to the wind sound and continued to move off in the same direction and same pace it had been going. Once it had moved on some way, I heard the birds resume their singing, and I ran into the house as fast as I could, dogs in tow. To this day, I still have no explanation. Could it have been aliens or some classified government aircraft? I have no idea. Thank you for letting me share my story. I've told a handful of people over the years, but it feels good to share it in writing. I hope you and all of your listeners are well. Regards, M. Our next story of the night comes from Charlie. Charlie's story is called Sleep Paralysis. Charlie says, I've experienced sleep paralysis my entire life. The earliest I remember having it was when I was 4 years old. I've come to learn how to wake myself up from an episode before it becomes too terrifying, but I still have very vivid, strong episodes in which nothing I do helps. This specific experience, which took place about 4 years ago, was by far my worst. I had just purchased my house, and was, for the most part, settled in. Furniture was in place, pictures on the walls, yet the house still felt unfamiliar. I was comfortable in the house, though. I never felt negative energy or that someone's watching me feeling, so I never had trouble falling asleep. Typically, when I experience sleep paralysis, it starts with an incredible vibration in my body, like the static on a television, but much, much more intense. On top of that, it's almost as if a jet engine is next to my head, running full blast. It's bizarre. I can almost always wake myself up when these symptoms occur by focusing all of my energy on moving one of my limbs. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case this time. My then wife always slept with the television on. Specifically, she liked falling asleep to a DVD of the Golden Girls show playing. So every night around 2 to 3 a.m., the title menu would come up after all of the episodes were played, and the intro music would play over and over until one of us turned the TV off. I understand this seems like a rant, but it's all relevant information. This night was like any other. We went to bed. She turned on the Golden Girls, and we dozed off. My dream that night was so vivid, it felt as if I were actually living it. The dream started with me standing in a kitchen of a house I'd never been in before. Everything was unfamiliar. It was clearly the middle of the night, and the house was dark, so I made my way around very slowly. I saw a staircase leading to the second floor, and I decided to go up it. As I neared the top of the stairs, I could hear music, very faintly, as if being played at a low volume. I reached the top of the stairs, turned left, and saw 3 bedroom doors at the end of the hallway. All of the doors were open, but only one room had any light coming from it. It just so happened to be the same room that the music was coming from. It was pretty obvious at that point that a television was on in the room. In the dream, I remember thinking how strange it was that the music kept repeating. It was a short, upbeat song that lasted about 20 seconds, and then it would start over. So I made my way to the room. I reached the doorway, and as I peeked inside, I saw me, lying on my side, sleeping. Then, I instantly woke up. I was paralyzed. I had fallen asleep on my side facing the wall with the bedroom door in sight. The TV was on, that damn Golden Girls title menu song playing, over and over again. Then, in a desperate attempt to move one of my limbs to wake up, I saw it, standing in the doorway. I have 10-foot-tall ceilings in my house, and the figure was still hunched over. It had to be every bit of 12 feet tall. Slim, featureless, with abnormally long legs, arms, hands, and fingers. It had no face, no eyes, no clothing, nothing. It was a 12-foot, pitch-black figure that, even without any facial features, I felt staring right at me. I went into full panic mode. I did everything I could to wake myself up, but to no avail. Every time I closed my eyes and opened them again, the figure was a little closer to me. This felt like it went on for an eternity, all while that damned music played. It made its way to my bedside, hunched over my body, and let out a horrendous noise. It sounded like the screeching of an engine, and it cut through me like a knife. My entire body vibrated, and I could feel an immense dread covering me like a blanket. I jolted forward, nearly falling out of bed. I was awake and no longer paralyzed. I immediately jumped out of bed and scrambled around the room, looking for an intruder, but there was nothing, and no one. Only my startled wife I had woken up in my panic, and the title music of the DVD with the theme song playing. It took me a moment to recollect the dream I had while asleep. The realization that I was that figure, or had somehow led it to my bedroom in a dream, still terrifies me. I rearranged my bedroom the next day and got rid of the Golden Girls DVDs. Still to this day, that upbeat 20-second song gives me the chills. Our next story of the night comes from Nick. Nick's story is called, A Ghost Makes Me Spaghetti. Nick says, Hello, I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I wanted to take the opportunity to share a story of mine. Just a little background. I was raised on Art Bell and the X-Files thanks to my dad. When I was a kid, I wanted to grow up to be a paranormal investigator. As an adult, I became a skeptic, but I've always struggled to make sense of this incident. I once lived in a house that was well over 100 years old. It was beautiful, with built-in features and tons of rooms. The woman I was seeing at the time and I moved in temporarily as caretakers. Almost immediately, we started hearing things. There would be a sound like a ball bouncing down the basement steps, children's laughter, the usual first signs of a haunting that you read about. At the time, I wrote it off as sounds from the neighbors, as our walls were thin, but my ex was spooked. One day while I was at work, she had her very religious mother come by with some holy water and sage, and they blessed the house. After that, there were no more incidents. For a while. For a number of reasons, the relationship ended, and almost immediately, the unexplained activity in the house began again. My ex was very emotionally abusive, and was also the only one who got a creepy feeling from our ghost. So after she moved out, I would joke that it just didn't like her. One night, I was making myself spaghetti, and stepped outside to have a smoke. I heard the timer go off for my noodles, but decided that overcooked noodles mattered less than finishing my cigarette. So I finished it, before heading back in. When I went in to turn off the stove, it had already been turned off, and my noodles were cooked perfectly. This was over 10 years ago, so smart appliances weren't a thing yet, and I was alone in the house. I joke now that the ghost wanted to help take care of me through the breakup. Other things that happened while I was living there include a voice whispering my name in my ear as I was in bed, but not in a creepy way, if that makes sense. It felt like someone trying to comfort me. There was also a sort of study off the kitchen that I never ever used, because it creeped the hell out of me. It had been the room I was most excited about before I moved in, as the windows were perfect for my plant collection. Once I settled in, though, I started feeling as though I was being watched by an angry presence every time I walked past the door, so I started keeping it closed. It fit very tightly in the frame, and had to be forced shut, and yet I always found it open later. My ex was also creeped out by the room and swore it wasn't her. I've never had any other experiences prior to or following what I experienced in this house. I will admit, however, that I was not sad when the time came to move out. Even a well-intended spirit is creepy when you live alone. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and I hope you and all of your listeners are safe and well. Nick. Our next story comes from Kelly. Kelly's story is called Strange Man. Kelly says, "Hi Nick, I've recently discovered your podcast, and I love listening to people's personal experiences, so I thought I'd share my own. This story takes place in my old house in Wyoming. When I was about 2 years old, I was taking a bath while my mom supervised me. The window on the wall to the side of the bathtub was large, but it had many tempered glass squares, so there was no way to really see out of it. This window was also high off the ground. As I was taking my bath, I pointed to the window, and I asked my mom to tell the man that was looking at me to go away. She was very confused because she didn't see anyone, and the window was too high, and the type of glass made it difficult to make anything out. She figured that if something was there, that it couldn't hurt me, so she told me to tell him to go away, and that I don't want to play with him. A few nights after this incident, my mom was cooking dinner, and I was in my playroom that was only a headshot away. At this time, I had no siblings, so I was completely alone. As my mom was cooking dinner, she heard me tell someone to go away, and that I didn't want to play with them. This freaked my mom out, but she stayed calm and asked me who I was talking to, and I told her that I was talking to the man from the other night. I don't remember what my mom told me after that, but I know that because this incident was so creepy, she had my grandma come to the house and do some sort of cleansing. Nothing ever happened again. I don't actually remember this happening since I was so young at the time, but just having my mom tell me about this freaks me out. Even though we have moved out of that house and to a different state, I still get the feeling like someone is watching me, and sometimes it becomes a fear that whoever or whatever is watching me might want to hurt me. When I was in my preteens, there would be times when I was showering, and I'd get the overwhelming feeling that someone was in the bathroom watching me, and that they were going to hurt me. I would curl up into the corner and start crying, until eventually the feeling went away, or until I mustered up enough courage to run out of the bathroom. This could all just be me being paranoid and thinking too much of it, but the fear and feelings I get are so powerful, I don't know if they're real or not. I would really love some second opinions to help me figure out how to make this fear stop. Sorry this is kind of long, but I figured I would share. Thank you for reading and sharing my experience. Our next story of the night comes from Karen. Karen's story is called Spirit Communication. Karen says, "Dear Nick, I've been listening to your podcast for over a year and I'm hooked. Thanks for the great content. I would like to share with you a few strange experiences I've had throughout my life. I would describe myself as an empath and a sensitive. Since childhood, I've had a connection with the otherworldly. About 2 years ago, my husband and I lived in an old house in an old neighborhood. Our stay there was peaceful, and I really enjoyed the energy of the old wooden floors, the high ceilings, and just the general energy of the place. The kitchen was open, and it looked out over the lounge. Our record player stood on a low shelf at the far end of the lounge, against a wall. One day, I was standing by our kitchen counter that looked right onto the lounge and the record player. I was making coffee and looked down for a few moments, putting coffee into my mug, etc. Usually, when the record player was switched on, its arm would make a distinct clicking sound as it moved from its resting place to the position just above the record. It made the same sound when you pressed the stop button, and the arm would move back to its resting position. As I was focusing on making the coffee, I heard that distinct clicking sound, loudly and clearly. I looked up and saw the arm of the record player move back into its position, as if it was just playing a record, and someone had switched off the machine. I also saw the record spinning slowly, coming to a standstill. What is strange is that neither the record player, the amplifier, or the speakers were switched on at all. The record player was not playing anything beforehand. I was alone in the house, and the cats were sleeping in another room. I was obviously shocked and surprised, but also grateful for experiencing this. I didn't feel threatened at all. I said in a loud, clear voice, "Thank you for making contact. I respect you, and ask that you respect me. I only allow love and light in my house." Our record player has never done anything like that, before or after. Another encounter, many years ago during my student years. I slept over at a good friend's house. He had made a bed for me, and he was sleeping on a couch in the lounge. I had just fallen asleep, when suddenly, very loudly, I heard my name being called. It was very loud and distinct, almost as if someone was shouting in my ear. I jolted awake and sat up. I then called back to my friend, thinking that he might have called me from the lounge. There was no answer, and I realized he was fast asleep. The experience was very real. I don't feel as if I was dreaming. It felt as if someone was trying to wake me up. I was not fearful as I went back to sleep, just really perplexed. Another time, I visited a spiritual healer and psychic. I wanted to ask her about my spiritual journey, but I also wanted to know if she could contact my grandmother, who had passed away a couple years ago. However, I didn't tell her anything about my grandmother, as I didn't want to influence her or force anything on her. I was also a new client, and she knew nothing about me. During our session, all I did was take out my grandmother's brooch and wristwatch, which I placed on the table in between us. I mentioned to the psychic that I wished to make contact with her. That was all I said. When I took the brooch and watch out, the psychic said to me, "Your grandmother asks that you place her brooch and wristwatch back in front of her photo in your room." I was shocked. In our previous house, I had placed those items in front of my grandma's photo, but we had since moved, and those items were packed away in my cupboard in our new house. I was very happy, but also a little surprised and shocked to receive this news, and I promised my grandma, via the psychic, that I will restore her items to their rightful place. I was very grateful for this experience, because I feel very connected to my grandmother. Today, my grandma's items are still in front of her photo. Thanks for the great podcast. I'm working my way through all the episodes. Best wishes, Karen. Our next story of the night comes from Brennan. Brennan says, "Hi Nick, I am hooked on your podcast. Keep up the great work. Here is one of my encounters. I've always had the notion that certain people perceive the spiritual realm more than others. I consider myself to be in that category. In 2016, my family and I moved into a house in Northern Virginia. The mother of the previous family who had owned it had unfortunately passed away in the house due to cancer. During our time there, I always had a negative feeling about the shed in our backyard. My room was located on the first floor of the house, and it had access to the backyard from a screen door. It also had a direct eye view of that shed in the backyard. One night I was asleep in my room, when suddenly I was awoken by the feeling of someone pushing down on my legs. It felt like when someone urgently shakes you to wake you up, but with all the pressure on my left leg. I got the perception that this woman was trying to wake me up. It thoroughly spooked me, but I was able to go back to sleep after a while. Outside my room, the porch light is motion activated. Over the course of my time living there, the light would always cut on randomly. When I would go to look, there would be nothing in sight. The light is super bright, so I would be able to see when it's an animal, causing the motion light to activate. But every time I looked, I see nothing. It would often come on in the middle of the night and wake me up. My sister also had a similar encounter, and here is her story. I was asleep in my mom's room on the second floor of the house when I awoke to a sensation of someone pressing down on my chest with all their strength. I immediately panicked and reached for my phone to shine the flashlight on whoever was in my room, but found no one there. On multiple occasions, all of the books on my shelf would be thrown off in the middle of the night. The house felt very wrong and made me feel very paranoid. I started having to sleep with the lights on at 17 years old because of it, and only in the past 2 years, after moving, have I stopped using a nightlight. Because of my encounters, I always kept that screen door locked. One time, my family and I went out of town on vacation. When we arrived back home, my dad realized that we didn't have a house key, and we were locked out. He went around to the back of the house to see if we could get in through one of the screen doors. He went to mine outside my bedroom, and it was unlocked. I had always kept it locked. I don't know if this is related, but I feel that it's worth mentioning. I don't consider myself much of a dreamer, but I vividly remember this dream, as it was one of the most frightening ones I've had. In my dream, I'm in my room, awakened by something. The layout of my room in my dream is exactly the same as in reality. In the dream, I look over toward the screen door to see what woke me up. Through the crack of the curtains, I see the porch light is on. I look more closely at the crack, and I see a man, about in his 50s. I get scared, and I try to slowly roll out of bed before he sees me. As I start to roll, he turns toward me and makes direct eye contact with me. He has a gun and aims it right at me and shoots. I instantly wake up. After these things happened, I asked my mom to go into my room alone and tell this woman to please leave her daughter alone. She goes in there and tells it, and after that, I didn't have any more encounters with her. Brennan. Our next listener story comes to us from Jonathan. Jonathan's story is called The Man at Night. Jonathan says, "It was summertime, and I was an elementary student. My dad was a teacher and was going to Houston, Texas for a teacher training. He would be 6 hours away for the weekend. At the house was my brother, my mom, and me. We all slept in the same room in a mobile home, down south on the border of Texas and Mexico. The first night he was gone was fine, but the next day, something unexplainable happened. The next day at bedtime, we locked all the doors and were getting ready for sleep. We decided to go to sleep all in the same room, since I was scared and young. Around midnight, I woke up to the door being open and a black figure lurking around the house. It looked like a man about 6 feet tall, wearing a dark trench coat. It was pitch black, and all I could see was his figure, and then his eyes. His eyes pierced my soul. They were like 2 flashlights in my eyes, but it instantly made me go to sleep. The next day seemed normal, and I forgot about the incident, but when I saw my mom, she asked me if I had opened the door, and the back door was also wide open, right where I saw the man. We searched the house, but all was normal, and nothing was stolen, and nothing ever came of it." Our next story of the night comes from Brittany. Brittany's story is called Ouija Board Predictions. Brittany says, "Hi Nick. I've always been interested in paranormal stories, but always took the skeptic's approach. That was until my friends talked me into playing with a Ouija board. I was about 21 or 22, and I had never played with one before, so my friend pulled out his old Ouija board, and about 4 or 5 of us started to play. We played around with it for a bit, but it never seemed to tell us anything or answer any questions, so everyone got tired of it, and eventually everyone had to go, except my friend Nathan and I. So we packed up the Ouija board and went to his house to continue playing. Once there, we started playing, and it seemed to be spelling out random letters over and over, but then Nathan said, 'It's spelling out Amy.' I asked, 'Who's Amy?' and he told me that was his mom's name. So we asked the board, 'What about her?' and it spelled out, 'Die.' And we asked when she was going to die, and it said, 9 days. While we were a little freaked out, we didn't think too much of it. There was no way that this thing could actually be real. We just brushed it off as a creepy Ouija board story that we could tell. 6 days later, I was back at my house, and the phone rang. It was Nathan. He called to tell me that his mom had passed away. I thought he was just playing a morbid joke, and said, 'Nathan, that's not funny,' to which he replied that he was serious. It turns out that his mom did in fact pass away. She had a few health issues, but nothing that was life-threatening. I went to her funeral and everything, and I couldn't believe that not only did the board tell us that she was going to pass, but it told us within the amount of days. I've never touched a Ouija board since then, and I do not plan on it. I've not wanted to seek out any paranormal since then for myself, but I love to hear about everyone else's stories. Thank you for listening, and keep it up. Sincerely, Brittany. Our last story of the night comes from Hudson. Hudson's story is called Stalking at Midnight. Hudson says, "This is a story from a few years ago. I was making routine trips to a nearby trailer park where a friend lived. We'd just sit up till 2 or 3 in the morning and talk about everything and our lives. One night 2 other guys joined us, and we went out to the wood line to smoke and stargaze. After about 20 minutes, with some light music and some side arguments, me and another guy are slowly becoming aware of a sound. It sounds like the walnut trees shedding nut pods at first, a sort of signature pop, followed by a crash as the nuts hit every drying autumn leaf on the way down to the forest floor. This sound is different though. No pop, no loud crash. Somewhere just inside the darkened tree line, we hear it. Crunch, crunch. Then it stops, and there's only silence for maybe 30 seconds. It was subtle, and we weren't even really paying attention at first, but it kept up. Crunch, crunch. I start looking at this other guy, and he's obviously trying to pretend that he's cool, but he keeps looking up from time to time. He's looking past me to the woods, about 15 feet behind my back. Crunch, crunch. It's official, we both hear it, and to make it worse, every 30 seconds or so, it's not in the same place. It's in 2 places about 15 feet apart. Crunch, crunch, to the left, then crunch, crunch, to the right. We're being stalked, and each crunch is a hair closer than the last. I look at this guy and he looks at me. We're over it. I get my friend's attention, and with the help of this guy, we break up his argument and make him listen. He says we're paranoid, and that it's just BS. Crunch, crunch again. We all stop. 30 seconds go by. Crunch, crunch. It's now obvious that no one is imagining anything. We pack up and start walking, but we have to go parallel to the tree line for 200 feet before we break out into the open field that butts up against the trailer park. We make the walk with little noise and turn to start heading into the streetlights. Crunch, crunch. It's following us down the tree line. We get back to the general safety of the trailers and lights. We all camp up on the porch with our backs to the wall and continue talking. My friend is ramping back up into his argument. We're all chilling, and then about 15 minutes goes by. Just off the porch is a street lamp. The edge of my car is visible under its white light. The walnuts are doing their thing again. We're all a little jumpy and playing it off. Then, just beyond my car, just beyond the light, in the darkened yard across the narrow street, crunch, crunch again. We all stop. It's following us, I state rather obviously. Needless to say, the fun's over, and I make my friends watch me as I leave to make sure I actually get into my car. Nothing else happened, but it didn't stop me from checking my back seat and hurrying home. As we once again come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast. And a big thank you goes out to Tosca, Lydia, M, Charlie, Nick, Kelly, Karen, Brennan, Jonathan, Brittany, and Hudson for writing in and sharing their experience with all of us. If any of you have thoughts, advice, or a similar experience that you'd like to share with one of tonight's storytellers, email me and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.